We're going to talk in an interesting, accessible form, because it's a very philosophical topic, about the sources of so-called cultural Marxism, about the people who were responsible for this, or what kind of strange beast is this cultural Marxism. First, let me ask you this question. So, recently, the reason actually I got in touch with you was the article published by you on cultural Marxism, where you tried to rebuke one of the philosophers who actually tried to say that cultural Marxism has something to do with anti-Semitism, and you tried to correct his view. So let's start here. So first, why do we think that the so-called Frankfurt School of Thought is in the center of this debate? So what is so special about this Frankfurt School of Thought that arouses so much controversy?
Well, I guess if you don't mind, I think what makes sense to do first is just to distinguish, because you had mentioned the person who, his name is Sam Moyn, who wrote the New York Times article arguing that cultural Marxism doesn't exist as anything other than a right-wing phantasmagoria and an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that's an updating of the old trope of Judeo-Bolshevism. I think that's some of his... and I think a good place to start would just be to clarify where he's right and where he's wrong, just so people are clear what we're talking about when we're talking about cultural Marxism. So is it okay if I say just a few words about that? Mm-hmm. Cultural Marxism is a term that, the term itself was, as far as we know, initially created by and used by people who are sympathetic to cultural Marxism. The first known use, and this is something I describe in the article, is by Trent Schroyer in a book written in 1973 called The Critique of Domination. And the book actually was nominated for the National Book Award. It was prominent at the time. And he was sympathetic to what he was describing. It's been used. The noted critic Frederick Jameson it was in the title of one of his books from 2007, and of course he as a Marxist was sympathetic to what he was describing. Dennis Dworkin, historian at I think it was at University of Nevada. Also, title of one of his books has the term right in it. So there's a long history of its use, respectably, in academic circles. Now, there is, however, let's call it a crazy conspiracy theory that originated. I think largely from William Lind. It was developed by several people and circulated in various circles on the extreme right. And the theory posits some sort of overt conspiracy by largely the members of the Frankfurt School, most of whom were Jewish, and that's why Sam Moyn said it was an anti-Semitic idea. And the conspiracy was because Marxism, because a communist revolution did not take place throughout the world, because all the nations didn't fall like dominoes after the Russian Revolution. And the cultural Marxists decided to engineer the revolution through other means, through a war fought on cultural terrain to seed the downfall of Western culture within, by infiltrating it and destroying it from within. And they have all kinds of, there's no evidence that there was such a conspiracy as far as I know. And they attribute all kinds of crazy ideas to thinkers. I think one example I used in the article is Theodor Adorno, who maybe we'll talk about a little bit more. They suggest that he was trying, as part of his work on the Princeton radio research project that he was working on, to bring about the downfall of serious music and have it replaced by jazz and pop that would dumb the people down. And it's so, if you've ever read a word of Adorno, it runs so counter to everything that he actually believes that it's crazy. So that's the conspiracy theory, and let's after this not have to say anything about it. It's unfortunate that it exists and that it sullies the use of the term. Now, more recently, the term has come back into use within mainstream conservative circles, and it's been used by Jordan Peterson and on a bunch of his videos. It was used in a prominent column by David Brooks of the New York Times. And they're not using it, so far as I can tell, in the crazy way. They're using it in the correct way. Now, the tricky thing here is that there's a substantial overlap between what the crazy conspiracy theory says and reality. So there are elements of the crazy conspiracy theory that are crazy and that are untrue. And then there's the reality that we'll talk about hopefully in a moment, and where you'll see that there is some overlap, and that's where people go, just if they start surfing online, can get confused. I think what makes sense is to start kind of in the same place where I started in the article, which is with the Hungarian Marxist Georg Lukács, who was not himself part of the Frankfurt School. So there's a basic issue in Marx where Marx, Marx of course adapts Hegel's dialectic, and for Hegel, change over time happens through, it happens on the level of ideas. You have one idea, thesis, kind of opposite idea taking hold, antithesis. Through this dialectical process, you have the synthesis, and gradually you have the emergence of the Hegelian Geist, etc. Marx turns Hegel on his head, famously, and so instead of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis happening on the level of ideology, you have it happening on the level of material conditions. Marx believes that material conditions are reality, and ideology, it's the best analogy I can draw is it's an epiphenomenon in the way that you have a theory of consciousness where the real activity is happening on the level of neurons, but then we experience this stuff we call consciousness. It has no causal role to play, but it's there. Marx used ideology sort of that way, where ideology is just a superstructure built on top of the reality of material conditions. And so ideology is always going to be an expression of those material conditions. If it's the case that capitalists control society on a material level, they also control its ideology. Okay? Now, Lukács identified a problem because for Marx, a proletarian revolution could only be brought about by the proletariat itself. But now we have an interesting contradiction, because if the ideology of the society within which the proletariat lives is determined by the ruling class, How is the proletariat ever going to snap out of that ideology, wake up and revolt? What's going to make them do that?
I would like you to kind of, to repeat this, because that's exactly what I noticed in your article, because many people who write about cultural Marxism, they do not mention this part. But this is a very essential. So I think that's what attracted people on the left, this linchpin. That how are you going to work with proletariat if it's also part of the system, right?
Right.
So could you, so as I understood you, so we have proletariat who cannot be revolutionary because it's kind of part of this capitalist society, right?
Right.
So we need kind of to do something spiritual, right?
Well,
go ahead.
We need to do something. Well, when I say we need, if we are interested in a Marxist revolution, in a communist revolution, then somehow the proletariat's consciousness must their ideology, they have to break out of this girdle of ideology that's a superstructure emanating from the base, material base of conditions created by the ruling class. So what is Lukács's solution to this? He comes up with this idea of reification. And the idea is that we have many phenomena in society that where contingent human relationships masquerade as eternal realities. So let me make this a little bit more concrete. A university, such as the one where you work, a university in reality is a certain set of contingent human relationships arranged in a certain way. Okay, there's certain relationships among people that we structure in a particular way. But when many of us think of a university, it's just a thing out there in the world that has an existence, and it has to be the way it is. And the same thing is true of a factory, of many of the kinds of institutions that we imagine. There comes a point, however, when the contingency of these institutions gets exposed, when for people who are immersed in them, when the inherent tensions and contradictions rise to the surface for people. So, for example, in a factory situation where people aren't getting sufficient wages to thrive in their society, they might start to think, well, is this really the way things have to be? Isn't there something we can do about this? And that process, and at that moment, the contingency of these institutions is exposed. People begin to organize in order to combat the conditions that they're now becoming conscious of. And in that process of organizing, there's a clarification that takes place, according to Lukács, where people really start to see who's with them and who's against them. Because, when labor, for example, organizes, suddenly you really see management and its allies respond and react. And this raises the consciousness of the proletariat in order that the proletariat begins to understand things are changeable. This isn't the way things have to be.
I'm sorry. Can we go through this again? Because I'm not following you in this case. So, the process of reification, it works like this. You have to to affect the minds of the working people somehow, to build them up, or what? Could you go through this again, just for us, to grasp the whole concept, because it's very important.
Sure. The minds of people are inherently going to be affected by the fact that there are these contingent relationships in society masquerading as necessary permanent realities, and so if there are, whether it's the working conditions, wages, and anything like that, where people think, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way a factory works. That's the way a university works. That's the way the whole tenure system and the way that adjuncts are paid and treated, about which there's been a lot of obviously noise. Any of these tensions at some point can result in people becoming a little bit more conscious of the fact that there's something changeable and contingent about the situation in which they find themselves. And when they start to try to do something about that, especially when they try to organize in kind of labor unions, it has the result of clarifying the situation, because they will often face reprisals from management, crackdowns of various sorts. And so for Lukács, that process of organizing in response to reification being exposed for what it really is, for these, that process of organizing leads to an elevation of the consciousness of the proletariat.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and so it's a kind of return of Hegelianism back into Marxism, because the worker becoming conscious of his situation is what leads to the promise of fulfillment down the road. But the key point is that it's necessary to raise consciousness in order to achieve any sort of proletarian revolution. It's not going to happen by itself. Why is this important for what comes later with the thinkers that follow?
But in the old Marxist theory, the classical, like Marxist-Leninist theory, it was this vanguard communist party that comes and like an enlightened master plants this revolutionary consciousness in the minds of workers and pushes them to the barricades. So here, Lukács, he was like Rosa Luxemburg. He was thinking about workers themselves, nourishing this revolutionary mind, right? That's
well, right, because within kind of more orthodox Marxism, there was always this debate about whether the revolution is going to be an organic outgrowth of proletarian action, or whether you need this revolutionary vanguard to elevate the people, which was closer to the reality of the situation. That of course they were being led, but Lukács addresses this on the theoretical level and explains why you do need an elevation of consciousness in order for people to actually revolt. Now, your question, your comment about the revolutionary vanguard actually is a good segue to the next link in the chain, which is the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, because he really does talk about the role of intellectuals in leading the working class to where he wants to lead them. So Gramsci is very important because he's the one who he takes Lukács's ideas and extends them much further. He comes up with this notion of hegemony, and this is a word that we hear all around us in various ways now, everywhere. And most of the people saying it have no idea where it originated from and what it means in any technical way, and they're probably not using it in any precise and technical way. But what Gramsci argued is that before, so he takes this starting point that consciousness needs to be elevated, proletarian consciousness needs to be elevated for a revolution to take place, and he develops it further. The mass culture represents the trenches and fortifications of the ruling class. Before you get to the actual power of the ruling class, before you can engineer any sort of revolution, you have to fight a battle for the content over the content of mass culture, because mass culture is an expression of what Gramsci calls hegemony, of the ideas, of the ideology of the ruling class. And so it's a kind of mass culture hypnotizes us for him, and makes us willing accomplices in our own subjugation. The role for him of intellectuals is he actually talks about a concept called the organic intellectual. The organic intellectual is someone who emanates from what he calls a subaltern class. The word now would be more an oppressed class, is the more colloquial term we would use now. Such an intellectual takes the common sense of the masses, which common sense is something we all grow up with, and it's a mixture of some realities and many illusions that are foisted upon us by hegemony, by ideology. And the organic intellectual refines that common sense into good sense. And so the intellectual has a role to play in elevating the consciousness of the masses, of the proletariat, so that they can fight this war over the content of hegemony. Sorry, I shouldn't say over the hegemony doesn't have, but over the content of mass culture, in order to lay the groundwork, essentially, for a proletarian revolution. A phrase that's often been attributed to Gramsci is that we need a slow march or a long march through the institutions. I don't think he actually himself said that, but it's certainly consistent with his thinking, and it is something that Herbert Marcuse, whom we'll get to, did adopt.
Let's continue talking about Gramsci, because I think that's what kind of created this controversy, because we're talking about hegemony, according to Gramsci, as I understood. So since it's bourgeoisie that exercise hegemony, so we have to exercise our left hegemony to kind of take away these institutions, and that's how we are going from up above to down below, instead of this old view when everything grows organically from down below, like what Lukács said, Rosa Luxemburg said, yeah?
Right.
And in this case, I think it's to some extent it's a Leninist position, yeah? It's a vanguard, so we do need a vanguard, yeah?
Yes. We need a vanguard, and we need this long drawn out battle over the content of mass culture, and it's only after we succeed in convincing enough people that they are oppressed. Well, Gramsci would probably not say convincing; he would probably say revealing to people that they are oppressed, and showing them the manner in which they're oppressed. Only then will we get enough energy built up for an actual revolution of any sort to take place. And so that idea of his is something that that idea that we need to capture the institutions is something that we're going to see again and again in the work of the Frankfurt School, but also just we see it in a lot of the thinking of the people who come after, even in the 1970s and 1980s, in a way that we can get into. But one thing I should make clear is that Gramsci, he was the work within which he was writing this stuff. It's called the prison notebooks, because literally he was imprisoned by Mussolini, and he was writing this in prison. It didn't get published until, even though it was written in the 1930s, it wasn't published until the 1950s. So when we talk about the Frankfurt School, they were by the 1950s, when they had access to this, they could be explicitly influenced by it. But before that, they were really working along similar tracks to Gramsci, but weren't explicitly influenced by his ideas. One interesting note, by the way, is when he talked about organic intellectuals, meaning intellectuals who come from the oppressed classes. Of all these people that we're talking about or will be talking about, he's the only one who actually comes from an oppressed class of any sort, meaning he actually is from the working class, whereas all these other people, for the most part, are children of bankers, businessmen. They're more traditional intellectuals, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, of course. There's another person who lived approximately at the same time, famous Herbert Marcuse. So he, like Gramsci, he was active in 1920s in Frankfurt, part of the Frankfurt School, Institute of Social Studies in Frankfurt.
Social research. Yeah.
Social research, yeah. That was formed in 1923. So Gramsci was active in 1926, 1927, 1928. So it's approximately the same time, right? So
yeah, but as I said, they weren't aware of his work because he was writing it in prison.
And I purposely actually wanted you to draw attention to this fact. On the other hand, we have Georg Lukács, who was active in Hungarian Revolution 1919. Then he goes to Stalin's Russia and lives there in 1930s, 1940s. Somehow survives this great terror. So we have people who didn't know about each other, right?
Well,
but who moved in the same direction to some extent, because that's what some people don't want to understand. They think about like some kind of cabal, this group of people sitting somewhere and masterminding, so it's not how it was. It was pockets of this intellectual thought here and there and everywhere, essentially, who were thinking about how to revise the revolutionary project, so it was something organic to some extent. It's spontaneous.
Yes. I mean, I should say this. The Lukács, when we were describing his ideas, I'm drawing mainly on his book History and Class Consciousness, and that's from 1924.
Yeah.
So Lukács is someone that the Frankfurt School was well aware of and was very familiar with and built on his ideas. So there is certainly influence. Yeah. As far as some of these other people, I had read. This was Perry Anderson, who is actually the brother of Benedict Anderson.
I didn't know. I just want to clarify that Perry Anderson is like a Western Mr. Marxist in the West. He is considered this guru of the Western Marxism, who wrote these general books, like comprehensive histories of Western Marxism.
Right.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes. So he in his book on the name of it escapes me. It's Considerations on Western Marxism is the name of the book, and he actually remarks at one point there that what's surprising is the extent to which the various intellectuals who comprised the Frankfurt School and what he calls Western Marxism didn't really read each other's work, didn't comment on each other's work that much. I mean, they were aware of it, and some of them, Adorno and Horkheimer, closely collaborated repeatedly over the years. But there was a lot of there were disconnects. There were these people were working, like as you were saying, along similar trajectories, but they weren't necessarily. They certainly weren't part of any conspiracy or cabal to take over anything.
So in this case, it might be more appropriate to talk about this, what Germans called by this word Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. So it was in the air, these ideas, because of certain circumstances, because of economic situation, because of, for goodness sake, social forces, intellectual culture. So it's a lot of factors were in work here, right? So that's what I'm trying to kind of emphasize.
Right. I think there is certainly there are certainly some connections among these people, and I mean, especially when you talk about the Frankfurt School, it is a school in the sense of being organized around some sort of more or less coherent mission. But so there's some direct influence, especially when we get to some of the people who are influenced directly by Marcuse. But yes, it's some of it is the Zeitgeist, some of it is simply, and some of it is just people who are influenced by Marx himself to think in a certain way about culture. One thing, by the way, that we haven't said here yet, and it's something that in the article I did say, if you ask what is cultural Marxism, part of the answer is what we're doing now, which is to talk about the various figures and what they thought. But if I were to give some sort of more succinct definition, understanding that it's a simplification, the idea is generally that culture is an outgrowth of underlying power structures, an outgrowth and an expression of underlying power structures, not in the crude orthodox Marxist way where it's a pure superstructure that has no causal role to play, but it is definitely connected to underlying power structures. And further, that's kind of point one, but further, point two is that the role of these intellectuals is to expose the links between various cultural productions and the various class and group interests from which they originate, and to critique them, and to combat the hegemony that's expressed in them. And I should say also that what the Frankfurt School is doing, it calls critical theory. That's the name that it gives to its project.
Here again, Alex, I want to interrupt you. Is it appropriate to say that what people on the right now call cultural Marxism? Of course, we have to remember that it was people on the left who were the first to use the expression of cultural Marxism. But now primarily this expression is employed by people on the right. Is it appropriate to say that what the current left call critical theory is the same what people on the right call cultural Marxism, or it's not exactly the same things? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, it's actually a good question, and I have thought myself about in speaking of it to say critical theory rather than cultural Marxism because it's not a loaded term in the same way, and my hesitation is that first of all, critical theory is often used more narrowly, really, to talk about the project of the Frankfurt School, and and we're talking about other people who weren't connected with, for example, Louis Althusser. When we get to him, if we do that, is not directly connected to the Frankfurt School. Lukács and Gramsci are not themselves part of the Frankfurt School. And then some of the later thinkers who were influenced by these ideas certainly aren't part of the Frankfurt School. Some of them may think of themselves as engaging in the project of critical theory. Others don't. So it's a little bit confusing in that way. But the other real reason to talk about cultural Marxism is, frankly, because it's evocative. Because I think it's important for people to understand the link between between really the transposition of an argument made in the context of material conditions and class interests to the cultural sphere. So I think, yes, it's a rhetorical device, but so is political correctness. I think that's an example I used in the article. Is another loaded.
Absolutely, term. So is neoliberalism, which I used before. It's for the left. is it's also pejorative, right? For
Yes.
it's you cannot avoid it because it's social scholarship. You know, there's a lot of definitions. They do
Right.
carry this some emotional connotations, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think one of the reasons that I think there is some sort of we do have an interest in attempting in really sticking with the term cultural Marxism, despite some of the unsavory associations it may have due to the conspiracy theory that I described. Although it is at this point more and more coming into mainstream use in the respectable right who aren't using it that way, as I said. And I my guess is that with time it will come to be freed of those negative associations, hopefully. But I think that we do have there's some use for to get people to really understand what it is we're talking about, and in effect, if to wage a kind of counter Gramscian campaign to get some of these ideas out of the institutions that they've infiltrated. And I when I say that, I want to be very clear that I think some of these ideas are interesting and valuable. I think, and to me, it's a huge mistake if people listening to this or anyone is interested in this stuff. By all means, don't go and start reading all the right-wing criticisms of cultural Marxism. Read the actual texts written by these people so that you understand what because they're interesting and valuable in some ways, and then after you read them, if you don't see what's wrong with some of their ideas, then go ahead and you can read some of the critiques. But I think it's very important not to blithely dismiss something or to just expose yourself to one side of the argument, which is something that we see all too often going on at this point.
What I guess upset people sometimes, I kind of feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about this because I'm part of this tribe, is kind of these ideas which we're discussing right now, they are predominantly present in academia, in contrast to the other ideas. So there's a certain disbalance, that's what sometimes we have to mention this, because of circumstances. I don't know if we're going to discuss this or not, because of some historical circumstances, we have prevalence of these particular ideas.
Yes.
Which also simplified, I guess, by some people on the left, and also fed to the people, and the people, instead of going to the sources, they absorb them and also create caricature. So we have two caricatures, one on the left and another on the right, and we have this kind of a battle of two caricature discourse.
I mean, all the time in conversations, I hear various terms being wielded by people who think of themselves as progressives, or in the pejorative term, social justice warriors, who talk about these things, structural racism, institutional racism, and sometimes when they're using those terms in a context where it really makes no sense, I'll ask them, what exactly are you talking about? And I get these stunned expressions, like, how can you not know? They don't know. They're repeating things that they've heard and read, and it's unfortunate that you don't get critiques of these ideas, which may have some value to them, but get inflated and applied to anything and everything in sight.
And it might be unavoidable because people in this in the heat of this ideological polemics, they unavoidably simplify the whole thing, so that's and eventually we have acolytes who kind of pick up these ideas, bits and pieces, and they need to belong, so they stick to the crowd. We are crowd animals. If you have this intellectual culture, like a bubble, it sucks you in and you don't want to be outside, so you want to be part of it. So you, like a parrot, you repeat this, what you just mentioned. Well, talking about parrots and ideological battles, I would like to bring to attention this the most popular representative of this tribe of cultural Marxism, Herbert Marcuse. So let's talk about him a little bit. Okay. So what made him so attractive in 1960s, 1970s? Okay, it's in what kind of gave him this long life after he kind of died.
Well, so first, one thing we should make clear, because people listening may not realize this, is that it's the Frankfurt School, but at some point after Hitler comes to power in 1933, they flee Germany, most of them, and initially are in Switzerland, and later many of them end up in the United States. And they establish a base at Columbia University initially, and then move out west, and partly because of Horkheimer's health and heart condition that kind of necessitated the move to a better climate. But so Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, does most of his work that makes him famous, notorious, whatever you want to call it, in the United States. And he's at several universities here, Brandeis, University of California, San Diego, several places. So Marcuse is interesting in that he's not what you would call a systematic, careful philosopher, but he's a very appealing figure to people who want to find almost a kind of philosophical justification for some of their outlandish or extremist positions. So I guess he writes a series of books, Eros and Civilization and One-Dimensional Man, and in those books he talks about kind of especially in One-Dimensional Man, the way in which American society and its mass culture co-opts everything and turns it into a kind of turns people into pawns, essentially, that support the hegemony of the ruling class, to put it in Gramscian terms. He has the view, in fact, that in a society where it's very clear, in a truly totalitarian society, it's very clear who's with you and who's against you and where the battle lines are. But in a society like the United States, what you have is this power of mass culture that seems to give people exactly what they want. He calls it repressive desublimation. So the idea is that it seems like all your desires that you could possibly want, whether you want access, you want sex, or you want flashy entertainments of various sorts. They're all given to you. You have everything much more openly available than you would in some sort of totalitarian society. But what that actually does is drive people towards individual fulfillment, which is unattainable in his view, and distracts them from the general totalitarian nature of the whole. And so the working class for Marcuse is a lost cause. And so this is very interesting. The traditional Marxist view, of course, is that, as we were talking about earlier, the proletariat is the source of the coming revolution. For Marcuse, and not just him, but Horkheimer says similar things, but Marcuse says it very, very crisply in a series of works and essays in the 50s and 60s especially. The American working class is so deeply hypnotized by by American culture that seems to give them everything that they want. The culture numbs them.
Deplorables, right?
The deplorables.
Okay. Okay.
And so whatever hope there is for any resistance has to come not from the white working class, but rather from groups that are more oppressed, that inherently have a lower status in our society. And remember, he's writing this in the 50s and the 60s, when the difference in status is much more apparent than it would be in the America of 2019. So these groups, African Americans, women, to some extent, other ethnic groups that are kind of more left out of the of mainstream American society, Marcuse sees hope in them because they are inherently much more conscious of what he sees as their oppression, and so they are easy fodder for radical intellectuals like himself. So that, your question was, why was he so appealing? Well, that's one kind of answer to why he's so appealing to he was very influential in to many of the Black Power groups that arose, and Angela Davis was a student of his. There are many students of his who played prominent roles. Angela Davis is actually an interesting case because she writes about I forget the title of the of her book, but it's there's the words women and race are in there. It's often thought of as one of the first texts of intersectionality, even though it's written in 1981, before the official coinage of the term intersectionality is from Kimberly Crenshaw Williams in I think 1989. But Angela Davis is someone that inspires the movement to a large extent. You can have a lot of fun tracing the influence of Marcuse to later thinkers who were very instrumental in a lot of what we see going on in our culture now. Now, another idea we should talk about with Marcuse is, of course, his idea of repressive tolerance.
Yeah, that's what the most controversial essay he wrote. Yeah, that's what offends a lot of people who are especially proponents of the free speech. They are very upset about this essay. Yeah. Because essentially he invites us in this particular essay called Repressive Tolerance that we need to shut down one side during the debate because they are bad guys, and give voice to so-called good guys, and the question, and of course he is the one who defines who are the good guys and who the bad guys are, so what
yeah, it's I think this essay, which I really recommend people read if they want to understand in a deep way the origins of political correctness and free speech crackdowns. It's so you will read things that will resonate very strongly with things you now recognize all around you. But it's very easy to lampoon and caricature Marcuse's argument because in some ways it is silly. But for the sake, but let's actually look at it just briefly in a way where I'll try to put the best face on it. So if you think about John Stuart Mill's idea of free speech, the purpose of free speech is not a goal in itself. It's not an end in itself. It has a purpose to allow the voicing of dissent and ultimately to cater towards to further the goal of greater justice, of human betterment, of freedom, all of these kinds of things. And so you can imagine a society in which, let's say, there are two viewpoints being voiced, and there are two alternatives about a certain subject, except one group voicing one of the views has microphones and megaphones,
Okay.
and the other group is just has nothing. They're just saying things, but no one hears them.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can imagine in that kind of situation why it would make sense for someone like Marcuse to come along and say, well, it's nice to talk about tolerance, which we tolerate everyone, except one side is doing all the talking that you people can actually hear. One group has a lot more power than the other.
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
And so I think if you come at it that way, it's not as crazy as it sounds, except this is where it gets crazy, I think. And Marcuse argues in the essay that there's an objective truth which can be discovered. I think that sentence is a quote from the essay, about which viewpoints are progressive and which viewpoints are regressive, and he's going to prove it to us.
Yeah. Remember, he said that historical record of the right is totally bad, but historical record of the left is good, despite minor flaws. That's what he says. Yeah.
Yes. It's what follows after he tells us he's going to show us the evidence or the method for figuring out which viewpoints are regressive and which viewpoints are progressive. What follows are two or three of the most incoherent paragraphs you'll find in an essay of this sort. But yes, it's essentially that when we look at the historical record, violence from the left has catered toward greater human justice and freedom, and violence from the right has not. And I mean, forgetting the flaws of using induction in this case. Just focusing on, I mean, obviously, Marcuse, who was writing this in, I think, maybe 1963, sometime around there, whether it's the Russian Revolution or what happened in China, and any of these, whether that furthered the cause of that kind of violence, furthered the cause of greater human justice and liberation is, shall we say, an open question. He wrote this before the Khmer Rouge had killed 25% of the Cambodian population in the 70s, so we'll excuse him for not knowing that. But obviously the argument is ridiculously flawed. But he, on the basis of this, concludes that therefore, the starting assumption is, okay, tolerance is great, but the reality is that the speech of the ruling class and conservative right-wing groups is being amplified, as it were, while the speech of progressive causes is not, someone could have constructed a careful argument about, this is what we should do to restore balance of powers, but that's not what he does. He says, therefore, we should really no longer tolerate right-wing viewpoints, and we should do everything in our power to further left-wing viewpoints. It's as flat as that. I mean, I probably have some quotes I could find from this if that are pretty bad as far as this is tolerance cannot be indiscriminate and equal with respect to the content of expression, neither in word nor in deed. It cannot protect false words and wrong deeds, which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. This is all nice, but I think obviously it fundamentally mistakes the basic idea that Mill has, that we don't know which words are necessarily false and which ones are wrong, and the whole purpose of free speech and allowing free speech is to create this cauldron within which within which truth can kind of emerge and be refined. And it may not be objective truth, but it's a kind of societal consensus that might emerge. Marcuse has a different view. So this essay is very influential, and there's another essay or talk called in 1967 called The Problem of Violence and the Radical Opposition, where he he talks about the distinction between a liberating violence and repressive violence. And again, it's the same distinction that violence that comes from oppressed groups is liberating violence, whereas violence that comes from oppressor groups is repressive, and he invokes a double standard for that as well. This should sound very, very familiar. All of this should sound very familiar to people who hear a lot of the discourse today. And so, for example, when you hear about the attempt to redefine racism from what used to be thought of as a belief system that kind of expresses it's a negative bias towards some group on the basis of race, there's a widespread attempt in academia, in the media, to redefine it into something where you have to have power in order to exhibit racism. That racism is not just a belief system; it's belief wedded to power, and for that reason, white people can be racist, but black people cannot be racist. It's a similar type idea to what Marcuse is talking about. These kinds of double standards are all over the place now.
But don't you think that we have this certain kind of quantity of people congregating together who naturally, in a kayaking way, spontaneous way, by sheer effect of congregating with each other, they promote these ideas. It happens by chance, spontaneously. So we have somehow, and what makes it interesting. So how we have this. Essentially the fulfillment of his prophecy to some extent. So the debate tilted toward now it's kind of a shoe on the other side, on the other foot.
But I think some of it is definitely ideas that are just spreading and people congregating. Some of it is a more direct line of influence that you can actually you can trace. I mentioned the example of Angela Davis earlier. There's another example I can give there's someone named Patrisse Cullors. She is one of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter. And she was trained by a Marxist named Eric Mann, who actually he I don't know how they initially connected, but he met her when she was 17 and kind of really trained her to be the person that she is today. Now, this guy Eric Mann, he was a part of the Weather Underground. And he also wrote a book called Comrade George, an investigation into the life, political thought, and assassination of George Jackson. Now, who is George Jackson? George Jackson was a black Maoist Marxist who was imprisoned and actually became Marxist and Maoist in prison. And at some point in 1970, there was a famous attempt by his brother to free him and some others from the prison. He was in prison for armed robbery or something like this, to free him. And in the process, a judge was taken hostage. Now, why is all of this relevant? The weapons that the brother used to do this were provided by Angela Davis. She was she was tried for this and acquitted. But this guy Eric Mann in the book argues that for the overthrow of the American government that's going to start in the inner cities and is going to be led by black people, and it's a precise echoing of Marcuse's arguments, and he obviously is linked. So you can draw these various threads. Another aspect of this is you can talk about something like critical race theory.
Okay, that's interesting.
So you might have heard of Michelle Alexander. She's the author of The New Jim Crow, which is a book that when people talk, and you hear this all the time about mass incarceration and the carceral state, these are concepts that in many ways are linked to this book. I mean, we're talking about the mass incarceration of black people. I'm not. We won't get into now the empirical aspects of whether that is happening, it's not happening. That's off to one side. But she's the author of it, and she was very inspired by Derek Bell at Harvard Law School. He is often thought of as the founder of critical race theory. Critical race theory itself comes from critical legal studies, and it's something that I think we were talking about a bit before we started recording. So critical legal studies is a discipline that started in Harvard Law School, where I was a student there, and actually took a class with Roberto Unger, who is one of the three real founding members of this approach of critical legal studies. He, Duncan Kennedy, and Morton Horowitz are usually thought of as the founding members of this group. And it's an approach to law that tries to look at the way that legal regimes are dictated by various group interests, whether it's racial interests or gender interests, or it's a kind of critique of existing positivist legal thinking from a vantage point that is very inspired by the Frankfurt School. And they will, if you for me to say that they're inspired by the Frankfurt School, I don't have to do any detective work. They have all. Duncan Kennedy has explicitly said that Marcuse was a huge influence on him. They've all talked about the Frankfurt School as a big influence. So, these are just two examples, but you can actually, and this is something in my article I didn't go into just because of space issues, but one of the criticisms of this whole idea of cultural Marxism is that you guys are saying that these ideas are everywhere, and you recognize them in everything, and it's a kind of loony. It becomes a loony conspiracy theory. And so part of it is what you said, that these ideas did, to some extent, infiltrate groups. There was the whole student protest movement was in the 60s was very inspired by Marcuse. Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, that group was very inspired by Marcuse. But critical legal studies and critical race theory and a lot of these other things, you can really draw the lines that Duncan Kennedy himself has explicitly talked about, how his goal was the long steady march through the institutions, and he feels that they achieved that. And so because at the time when he started at Harvard Law School, it was a much more conservative place. And one thing also that's interesting to think about in this context is some of the statistics about what's happened to the professoriate over time. Because many people believe that that the countercultural movement of the 60s immediately kind of yielded some sort of sweeping change in academia. But in reality, and for this I have to, I don't have the numbers in my head, but it's interesting that the proportion of faculty who identified themselves as liberal or left actually declined from 45% in 1969 to 39% in 1984. Okay. So it's not that the countercultural movement of the 1960s in itself was sufficient to engineer the leftward lurch. But what's interesting is that if you start looking now at the data from the 90s and beyond, when there's been insufficient time for these ideas to percolate, you get something very different. So in 1984, as I said, 39% of faculty are left or liberal, 34% are right or conservative. Now, by 1999, those numbers undergo a seismic shift from 39% left liberal to 72% left liberal, and from 34% right or conservative to 15% conservative. Within the humanities, 81% of faculty identify as left liberal. So these are numbers I'm drawing from a 2005 paper from Stanley Rothman at Smith College. So this is 2005. Today,
that's
actually,
amazing. I didn't know about it. It's amazing what you're just saying. So basically, the ideas needed some time to sink in, and then they popped up, right? Somehow. Okay, go on. Okay.
Yeah,
so
I mean, I absolutely. And I think just one thing I would add is today there's the numbers are even more dire. There's this. I'm looking at National Association of Scholars report from April 2018, tracking the political registrations of 8,688 tenure-track professors at top liberal arts colleges, and they found that 78.2% of the academic departments in the sample have either zero Republicans or so few as to make no difference. In the newly emerged ideological fields, gender studies, African American studies, there's not a single Republican with an exclusive appointment in those fields. So, but yes, to answer your question, yeah, it took a little bit of time for the long march through the institutions to have its effect, and there are other reasons for this that we can go into about why academic departments and humanities departments became more susceptible to that leftward lurch at a certain point in time and not before. I think it's a very interesting argument, but I'm not sure I'll let you dictate kind of where we go from here.
Okay, the reason I'm asking you about this is simply because I'm always worried about this disbalance, you know?
Yeah.
So no matter where you stand, you might be on the left, on the right, but you do want to expose your students to all kinds of ideas. And when you hear, like, for instance, names of Karl Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Betty Friedan, Michele Foucault, and you don't ever hear the names like Robert Nozick, F.A. Hayek, or von Mises, or even some kind of Marxists, you know, who are ditched, and even classical Marxists are not mentioned anymore, you know, because they are not politically correct, you know. For instance, right now, I recently read a few books where old-type leftists who are class-based, you know, they're really upset about what's going on with the mainstream left, you know, because they replace this class with the race and gender, literally removing class from political discourse, philosophical discourse,
right.
And it makes them very much upset. You know, there's a kind of great debate. Actually, it's going on since 1980s, but now it's so heated that I recently read a book by an American Trotskyite. Of course, these are marginal groups, you know, who are class-based, you know, because they are marginalized right now.
Right.
So they have no voice either. So that's the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting consequence of the move that Marcuse made, and that probably didn't fully anticipate, is that his thinking was, okay, forget the white working class, as we were saying. Let's focus on, and forget the class in general. Let's focus on these oppressed groups and try to radicalize them further. And hopefully they will pull the white working class with them eventually. I mean, that's the general idea. It's not just to have some people angry. It's the idea is to create to do what Lukács wanted to do, to raise mass consciousness, but do it through this approach where you're focusing initially on culture and focusing on these people who are, in today's trendy term, marginalized. But in the end, you're going to draw the working class with you. The unanticipated consequence is that this whole identity movement developed a life of its own, and in the process, the white working class became antagonized.
And now we have this. Again, we are not saying. Of course, it could be a backlash reaction. Like something on the white side. There is the same thing. If you talk about Latino power, Black power, right? Red power, you unavoidably, sooner or later, you produce a backlash. And the problem is that it's a big issue. Do we need to go this? It's kind of a slippery slope, you know what I mean?
But, absolutely. Yes.
But at the same time, we are trying right now, what I'm inviting you right now, to build a possible scenarios where this process will go to. Because look, I guess you and I, we agree on one thing, that so-called cultural Marxism, it did something that rose natural and spontaneously as reflection of certain sentiments on the left, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, to what extent it survives this situation, because on the one hand, we say that, yes, a lot of young people, millennials, they're hooked on socialism. But on the other hand, I see some people who are more and more drawn to kind of individualism in a good sense of this word. They are not, when they kind of plunge themselves into this identity discourse, they ask themselves the questions: what is going on? What the hell is going on? Because the reality is totally different. What this discourse describes, again, you said it acquired life of its own. What it describes right now, it might be relevant for 1960s, 1970s. And when they compare this, they say, where did you come from? Where you got stuck in the past? And when I see a lot of young people, marriages of different races, colors, who don't care about this, who don't... And some of these people who kind of were active in this past battles, they say, oh, they don't care about the past. But I think it's good that young people, they are less and less concerned about. They are more looking into who we are as individuals. They, maybe by going this direction, identity direction, they to some extent destroy themselves. The more they go into this small groups, like my theory is that with this transsectional theories, they more and more intersectional identity. They are more and more balkanized the identities. They make them more and more minuscule.
Right.
And eventually, what they might end up with, it's the human being, as the ultimate minority, as a couple of times I mentioned before when I talked with people about the same thing, So, and eventually we come to the ultimate minority, human individual.
In this context, I can't help but think of a recent remark from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a constant source of entertainment, but she talked about how she has cisgender privilege because she's not transgender, and so she will never understand what it's like to struggle with that, and really when you think about that, there are so many possible conceptions. We all have some sort of privilege, of course, but it becomes, like you said, eventually it devolves into we're just individuals, and individuals have all kinds of advantages and disadvantages over others, and why you want to break it down along the lines of race, for example, or some of these, as opposed to, if you want to talk about privilege, talk about wealth privilege. That at least I understand, because there's the very direct correlation, obviously, between people who have money and people who are doing well in all kinds of other ways in society. Race, if you look at the average income of the white working class and the black working class and the Asian working class, the white wage is somewhere between the average white wage between the black working class and the Asian working class. But the more important thing is that it's all down, in the 20s and 20,000 something, 30,000 something. It's all low. There's not some significant advantage that the white working class enjoys over the black working class. It's race, in other words, is not by any means the most intuitive, salient boundary along which people can be divided, except that it's very obvious to us. We look at people and we see them, and so when Marcuse and people following him talked very explicitly about African Americans and the black working class, and it was. Maybe it was in some ways a good strategic move because it was an easy way to appeal to a large group of people. But as we're saying, there is this backfire effect that's happening, where you're really alienating lots and lots of people who maybe, if the left were more strategic about it, they would be natural allies in a different conception of the problem. I don't know. But.
Yeah, and I think to some extent the left, they got stuck into this, I would say, the group mentality of the 19th century, because originally, during the French Revolution, the left, they were individualists. They were more about individual identity, as far as I know, But later, because of these kind of wars, because of this mobilizing schemes, they created the so-called left identity in the 20th century, and they became so hooked on this. So it's, again, I'm speculating here. It might be hard for them to disentangle themselves. It's basically you have to shed your identity. Okay, that's
right. Well, the group identity thing is I mean, that is something that is very Marx inspired, as filtered through the Frankfurt School. And this is something where this may be of interest to some people who may be wondering, well, what about Marx isn't the only one who argued that power is what kind of determines the content of culture. You can find that a similar idea to some extent in Nietzsche, for example, and Foucault, who was inspired primarily by Nietzsche. But there is an important difference, and if you, I actually read not that long ago an interesting comparison of Gramsci's notion of hegemony and Foucault's notion of power knowledge, the discourse, because there are a lot of similarities there. But one important difference is that Gramsci sees hegemony as the outgrowth of a class interest. And he sees power, an individual cannot exercise power unless he represents some sort of class. Whereas for Foucault, following more closely in line with Nietzsche, power is reflected everywhere. It's in the structure of knowledge, in the discourse, but it's not. There isn't this subdivision of people into either classes or groups. That's a more Marxist or Marx-inspired line of thinking. Even though there is some overlap, and someone like Edward Said, the author of Orientalism, who was very influential in post-colonial studies and the Balkanization of a lot of literature departments, he was inspired both by Gramsci and by Foucault, because, like I said, there is overlap there.
All right, I think we had the prolonged conversation. Of course, we didn't cover all the things related to this phenomenon of cultural Marxism, but at least we tried to cover the basic names and events, and I hope we kind of shed some light on this. So we will appreciate all the comments, critique, curse words, praises, everything. And I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you so much, and I hope we will see each other again.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.